I am going to suggest that the world we want to live in looks remarkably like the world we live in. And let me tell you why. We are living through an extraordinary moment in history, an extraordinary period in history that is marked by four rather distinct and unique phenomena, which have been rare in history and certainly unique in that they all come together. The first is great power peace. Peace among the great powers. If you ask yourself, look at the 7, 8 richest countries in the world. Are they in significant geopolitical, geomilitary competition with one another? The answer is no. You can find a few shenanigans here and there that the Russians are doing, a little bit of arm wrestling between the Chinese and the Japanese. But compared with any historical period, what is striking is the absence of geopolitical competition among the great powers. In other words, great power peace. The second phenomenon, which builds on that first one, is the creation of a global market economy which has allowed for the rise of living standards of average people over the last 3 or 4 decades. If you think about it, we have created in the Western world and increasingly are creating in the rest of the world a mass middle class. This is a historically unprecedented phenomenon. The idea that there could be wealth, significant wealth, among middle class people is simply without precedent in human history before really the end of the Second World War. The first broadening of that area of circle was, of course, the United States. After the Second World War, it broadens to Western Europe. After 1989, it broadens to Eastern Europe. And over that period, you begin to see the rise of China, South Korea, Taiwan, and now, of course, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and now, of course, China and India. Between China and India, 450 million people have been raised out of poverty in the last 25 years. That is more people than have been raised out of poverty in the preceding 150 years. So we are living through something quite extraordinary in economic terms. And there is a related phenomenon, which I would point to not because of its purely economic dimension, but because of its social dimension, which is we are living in an era of extraordinarily low inflation. Why is that important? Well, if you go back to the 1970s, the world I grew up in was beset everywhere by inflation. Hyperinflation of some kind or the other was the norm in almost every country. Now, hyperinflation is in many ways more destabilizing socially than a recession. A recession means you lose your job, you lose the prospects of future wages. Hyperinflation destroys not what you might have had that job been available, had those raises and bonuses been available, but what you already have. It destroys the present, not the future. It destroys your assets, and thus it destroys the middle class. And if you look at the social consequence of destroying the middle class, it is extraordinary social instability. You have also lived through a period of extraordinary technological revolutions that have empowered ordinary people. Now, one can exaggerate the importance of these phenomena, but it is in fact true that the rise of the information revolution has had the effect of turning information, which was essentially a one-to-many medium, into a many-to-many phenomenon. Everyone is connected, but no one is in control. It has its problems, but it has had the effect of breaking the monopoly over the power of information, over the power of technology, and it has had the effect of further connecting and consolidating this global economy. And finally, we have been living through a period which I would call a kind of Anglo-American consensus. That is to say, ideas about the way in which you should organize your politics, the way in which you should organize your economics, the way in which you should organize your society, have verged toward Anglo-American ideas that exalt freedom, individualism, liberty, whether you look at the role of women, You look at the role of individuals versus their families. In all these areas, you have seen a kind of template for the world that was set by the Anglo-Americans. It also, of course, involves broader conceptions about politics and economics, such as trade. Now, I realize that we are living through a period of enormous and tectonic shifts in the world system. That was what my last book was about. And there is no question these are very profound. I would describe the world we are living in as one that is going through a power shift at the scale of the one experienced in the 16th century with the rise of Europe, on the scale of the one we experienced in the late 19th century with the rise of the United States. We are experiencing a phenomenon that I describe as the rise of the rest, because it is really not just happening in Asia, but primarily in Asia. You see this extraordinary rise of countries around the world finally being able to participate in the world global system effectively. So does this extraordinarily important phenomenon have the effect of threatening all the conditions I described? You know, are we at a point where we will look back nostalgically at a world of great power, peace, of a broad middle class, of low inflation and thus social stability, and of a technology that seemed to have the effect of empowering human beings rather than regimes? I don't think there is an easy answer to the question, but let me suggest again why I think there is some room for optimism. The great problem with the spread of democracy, and Jacques was worried, I think, that I was not going to come around to talking about democracy. But the great worry that I've always had about the rise of democracy has not been the rise of countries like China, modernizing societies that are modernizing their economy. It is a problem I have with countries like Nigeria, which have adopted the trappings of democracy with none of the inner stuffing that goes with it, none of the constitutional order. The simple fact is, I know that there are many fears and concerns about a place like China. The simple fact is, as countries modernize their economies on market principles, you see an almost ineluctable widening of the sphere of personal freedom. With market developments, you do see the rise of liberty. There is a very simple piece of data on this, which is a mass correlation of all the countries that have ever gone democratic and sustained those democracy. Seymour Martin Lipset, the great American political scientist, pointed this out in the 1960s, and it has been confirmed in every empirical study done since, which is, as your per capita GDP rises, there appears to be a point beyond which it is both extremely rare to have a non-democracy, and it has hitherto never happened that you have had a democratic reversal. The second point is that around that point, 6,000, 6,400, I think it is, no consolidated democracy has ever had a regression. The Argentinian coup, by the way, is the high point on that scale. That is why you even have to go up to 6,500. Otherwise, you'd be at about 5,000. So my point is simply, when you look at China, two things. First, keep in mind that China today is a much freer country than it was 30 years ago. Freedom is not simply the ballot box. It is the freedom to move, to work, to own property, to live where you like, increasingly in China to worship where you like if you do it very quietly. These are all freedoms that John Locke would have recognized. These are all freedoms that Thomas Jefferson would have recognized. They are the constitutive elements of Western liberal democracy, though they, of course, apply more to the liberal part of that phrase than the democratic part of that phrase. So all of which is to say, I worry less about the modernizing countries of the world, because I do believe you will see over time that they will expand the sphere of personal liberty, and eventually China will become more pluralistic than it is now. What I worry about is actually not the fate of liberal democracy in the periphery, but it is the fate of liberal democracy at the core. Western liberal democracy is becoming something like a supernova, dazzling and something to be admired in the outer reaches of the universe, but increasingly becoming somewhat hollow here at home. And I worry about it on a number of dimensions that relate to the ones I was describing. The first is what somebody once called demosclerosis, the inability of our democratic system to really do anything. It is simply failing on the grounds of being able to solve the problems of the country, plan for the future, build for the future. We face a reality, a demographic reality in almost every Western society, that we have taken on extraordinary burdens for the state that are no longer going to be affordable over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And yet it is impossible in any Western society to do anything about this, because our democratic system has created a vice-like grip where the special interests of the present exercise total control, and there are, of course, no special interests for the future, no special interests that worry about our children, our grandchildren, the industries of the future, the planet of the future. And yet, we have very powerful special interests that are able to block, veto, and demand ever more from the state. It is the tyranny of the present over the future, and it is very much a constitutive feature of modern Western democracy. My final point is the disturbing rise of illiberalism in the West itself. And you can see this in different ways from different directions. You can see it in the rise of nationalist parties in Europe. You can see it in the rise of a degree of intolerance towards immigrants, toward Roma. You can see it in the United States, where you have had this extraordinary debate about whether or not an Islamic center can be built two blocks from ground zero. And so I conclude by saying again, I worry less about the fate of democracy in far-off places like China, and I worry a great deal more about what is happening in the United States, in Europe. And ultimately, these are connected, because what has to happen is a revival of faith in the Western system, a faith in the Western constitutional order, a belief that this applies to all human beings, and a sense of optimism and generosity about that, rather than what we now appear to have, which is a narrowing, a closing down of the Western mind, a fear of Mexicans, of Muslims, of Roma, of immigrants. And as a result of that, of course, what will happen more than anything else is the power of the West, which ultimately was always the power of an idea, will be lost. Because it will not be, you will not be able to distinguish narrow parochial French nationalism from narrow parochial Chinese nationalism or narrow parochial Japanese nationalism. What was distinctive about the West was this dedication to universal values, despite the fact that there would often be mob rule opposed to them, despite the fact that there would be majorities that would be opposed to them. If we lose that, in a sense, we are losing the distinctive element of the West, which has been, in my opinion, a great gift to the world. Thank you.